From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
A mysterious secret national security threat roils Washington this week as Donald Trump gets a date for his first criminal trial, the hush money case in New York, and maybe a disqualification of Georgia District Attorney Fani Willis. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, editorial board members Kate Batchelder Odell and Monet Ukwe-Barua. The fur in Washington this week started with a cryptic statement from Congressman Mike Turner. Here's what he said today. The House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence has made available to all members of Congress information concerning a serious national security threat. I am requesting that President Biden declassify all information relating to this threat so that Congress, the administration, and our allies can openly discuss the actions necessary to respond. That was followed with all sorts of leaks and rumors. It was something about space. Then there was a reporter that caught a congressman coming out of the skiff, the area where they're allowed to view classified material. And his quote was, "It's definitely not about aliens." So sorry to disappoint listeners there. Then the rumor that it had something to do with nuclear capability, but not exactly clear what that quote was supposed to mean. Let's listen to White House spokesman John Kirby responding as much as he says he can to these rumors.
I know that Chairman Turner's letter to House members and his subsequent post on social media about a national security threat has prompted a lot of questions. While I am limited by how much I can share about the specific nature of the threat, I can confirm that it is related to an anti-satellite capability that Russia is developing. I want to be clear about a couple of things right off the bat. First, this is not an active capability that's been deployed. And though Russia's pursuit of this particular capability is troubling, there is no immediate threat to anyone's safety. We are not talking about a weapon that can be used to attack human beings or cause physical destruction here on Earth. That said, we've been closely monitoring this Russian activity, and we will continue to take it very seriously.
Kate, what the heck is going on here? I mean, I guess that it's comforting that this is not a secret Russian weapon that can harm anyone here on Earth. But if it has broad a threat to satellite capabilities, that could cause an awful lot of disruption and devastation.
So certainly appreciate the attempt to calm the public impulse to start heading for the bunker. You know, Speaker Mike Johnson said steady hands are at the wheel, which I think he also meant to be reassuring, but made me reflect on whether that's really the case with our current government. But there's a lot we don't know about what exactly this capability is. But I think it's worth taking a step back about what our satellites are and how vulnerable they are. For a long time, we've relied on a small number of large satellites in space, the size of a school bus. These are big turkeys for our adversaries to try to take out. And because we're so reliant on them for GPS, for missile warning, anything our troops do, our troops' movements rely on satellites. Our precision-guided weapons rely on GPS guidance. We're really reliant on satellites both for our everyday life in the homeland and for our military operations. So that has made them a very attractive target for some of our adversaries. And so Russia and China have been working for years to develop ways to take out our satellites and blind us. And so that's fundamentally what we're talking about. And so what I'd say about the Kirby comment is that it's, of course, trying to calm the public down immediately, but I think it's actually a disservice to suggest these weapons are not an immediate or harmful threat that we should be focused on. I think it's clear that if we are not developing countermeasures fast enough to stop Russia and China from blinding us in space and causing havoc either in the homeland or keeping us from being able to operate abroad, that's a big threat that the public needs to know more about. And so I think Turner here, who's caught a lot of grief, we can talk more about that. I think he's saying declassify what we know and let's have a public dialogue about it. And I think that's appropriate given from what we know so far.
It also raises questions, Monet, about how advanced America's capabilities along the same lines are. And some critics have pointed to this statement in 2022 from Vice President Kamala Harris. Here's the White House fact sheet. It says that she is announcing the United States commits not to conduct destructive, direct ascent anti-satellite missile testing, and that the United States seeks to establish this as a new international norm for responsible behavior in space. And the context of this is previous Russian tests that have created all sorts of debris that is a danger not only to satellites, but to the International Space Station, to any manned space flight. There was a test on November 15, 2021. This is from U.S. Space Command. It said it struck a Russian satellite, created a debris field, generated more than 1,500 pieces of trackable orbital debris, and will likely generate hundreds of thousands of pieces of smaller orbital debris. So, Monet, I understand the instinct from the United States' perspective that it would be great if all of our adversaries decided to be good actors in space and not do those kinds of tests and develop these kinds of weapons. Although I think that's maybe giving Vladimir Putin a little bit too much credit. And if he is going into space, it's hard not to think that the Pentagon definitely should be there first.
Well, I think that statement from Vice President Harris and the accompanying policy of the United States actually choosing to limit or suspend its tests of anti-satellite weapons is both horrible and completely representative of what the Democratic Party's approach recently has been to diplomacy and warfare, in that they very much believe that if the United States reaches out to our adversaries and says we're willing to move first in the direction of limiting our own capabilities in the hope that our adversaries will follow suit, then that's how we can avoid escalating and avoid being dragged into a potentially harmful conflict for all sides. There's an ounce of logic to it in the sense that our adversaries also know that they have a lot to lose. Russia and China obviously understand the practical problem with space debris that comes from the tests, and also the threat of being drawn into space conflict, the likes of which no nation on Earth has seen before. But frankly, they've shown themselves to be consistently ambitious. They've poured a lot of money and a lot of focus in developing their space capabilities, both offensive and defensive, and there isn't really any sign that they're willing to slow down. And so for the United States to unilaterally say that we're going to be limiting our own tests without any commitments or any way to enforce that same action in our adversaries is hopelessly naive. And I do think that there's the timeless naivety of that kind of approach, moving unilaterally. But with space question, it's also particularly ill-suited to the challenges that the United States is facing, because I think we're moving so fast in terms of how weapons are being developed in this sphere, crossing new frontiers very quickly. A lot of the capabilities that are being developed are never before seen and are completely up for grabs. And so it made a certain amount of sense, I think, in 1967 to agree to the Outer Space Treaty, suggest that we're going to keep space unmilitarized. But now that we've reached this point where both states and private companies are able to develop space capability very quickly and much less expensively than they previously were. And it seems like there's the chance of really losing a lot of ground very quickly to Russia or China. It's particularly bad to say that the United States is not going to pour every resource it possibly can into making sure that we have supremacy in that space. So hopefully Mike Turner's leak can be the wake-up call that Kate suggests, and policymakers will realize how much is at stake and how short the window is for the United States to regain its lead.
Kate, what do you make of the remarkable manner that this debate has taken place? First, with that statement from Turner, and let me read again. This is a piece of an Axios report on the Kirby statement. He said the U.S. has known about the weapon for many, many months, if not years, but in recent weeks, the intelligence community was able to, quote, assess with a higher sense of confidence exactly how Russia continues to pursue it. So, Kate, that is fascinating because it suggests that what Turner is talking about is not news to anybody in the national security space, but it is definitely news to the public. And maybe some of these debates about how the U.S. should be responding or what the role of the Pentagon is in going into space, maybe some of those have been happening behind the scenes. But it is hard now that we have had this big flap in Washington to think that the White House does not owe the public a stronger explanation of what's going on here.
Yes, I mean, the underlying evidence either exists or it doesn't. And so Turner clearly thinks that what he knows will stand up to the public scrutiny. And so I think that it makes sense to declassify it. And clearly, I don't think the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee would have done this if he didn't perceive that was the only way to get the information declassified and out into the public for debate. I think he deserves some credit for trying to wake up the public and involve them in understanding what some of the new nascent risks are to the homeland. Now, to your point, there has been an awareness that our satellites are vulnerable and that we need to mix up our strategy in space. And the core way we've been doing that is by launching more and smaller satellites, so making our network more resilient and relying on a diverse mix of satellite constellation up in space. So those efforts are underway. However, there is a question of how quickly we will implement them. And one thing that I can't help but notice is that the Pentagon doesn't have an appropriation for 2024. We're still trying to get basic government funding bills done, and some space priorities that the Space Force has wanted to do are still in limbo, waiting for funding from Congress. So I think this is one example of where the public is just not yet tuned in to what's really going on in the world and how vulnerable the homeland is and how vulnerable even our own forces are that would be abroad. So I think this should be a moment that captures the public attention. I guess the last thing I'll say too is that it also, I hope, will be galvanizing about the underlying nature of the threat from Russia. I hope that it will cause some public reflection that what's going on in Ukraine is not limited to what is happening in Ukraine, that Putin has much bigger ambitions and that his chief enemy is the United States. These kinds of capabilities to make that clearly obvious. And what he wants to do here, again, with these satellite weapons, anti-satellite weapons, the goal is to make it so that he can hold our satellites at risk and hold a gun to our head and keep us from trying to oppose any of his actions, keep us from responding to him. And so I don't think Americans want to be held hostage that way. And so more folks should know about it.
One final thought on this topic. Kate mentioned the Pentagon's appropriation and these new dangerous times that we're facing, particularly with Russia. We now have a land war going on in Europe. I would throw in China to the mix and the prospect that Xi Jinping could decide that the next few years is the best opportunity to take Taiwan. That is something that is definitely on the minds of policymakers in Washington. And yet the arguments that we are having in Congress and in the White House, I think, are not meeting that moment. And I would point to the conversation we had earlier this week about the spending and the deficit and the debt numbers. The projection from the Congressional Budget Office is that defense spending in 2024 will be 2.9% of GDP, falling over the next decade to 2.5% of GDP. And that compares pretty unfavorably with the years of the Reagan buildup, say. So 1985, defense spending was 5.7% of GDP, and that is lower even than in Vietnam, 8.6% of GDP in 1968. And Monet, when you start to think about a world in which there are peer adversaries to the United States, again, China and Russia already on the move. And it seems to me that Congress needs to really take this more seriously than it is. And maybe this wake up from Congressman Turner will be a piece of that.
Absolutely. I think that around the world, America's adversaries are watching this moment and watching the movement of Congress and the president, or the lack thereof, and really gauging what the stakes are going to look like for potential conflicts with the U.S. in the years to come. I think that there's a short-term political problem that anyone with eyes to see will have witnessed in the past couple of weeks, with the Republican Party in particular having clearly arrived at this new moment where there's a deep division over any ability to fund preparedness for foreign conflicts, failing to pass supplemental assistance for Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza, failing to pass additional support for Ukraine, despite having done so in several rounds over the past couple of years while that war has gone on, and failing to help to prepare Taiwan for a potential invasion from China are all things that would have shocked a lot of the American public just a few years ago in the sense that these are fairly long-standing American commitments, places where we know that our rivals are able to gain ground if the U.S. isn't willing and able to put up the billions. Then there's also the structural problem that you pointed to, which will play out a little bit more in the long term, but which also will bear on American preparedness. There simply is going to be less money available for our priorities as more of federal spending is devoted to entitlements, and there seems to be no willingness among Congress to actually create a solution to that because they know it would require too much of a political cost. And you've seen more and more denialism from politicians about that question. But I do think it's still important to point out that the United States does still generate more than enough wealth to be able to fund these priorities if the political will were there. Compared with our rivals, we're in a very strong position as far as growth. Obviously, we've seen inflation eat away at our spending power over the course of the past few years, but the United States economy is still growing very robustly compared with Western Europe and also in light of the slowdowns that we've seen in Russia and China. And so it does show that this is more of a question of political will, both being able to back our allies and put that funding in motion and also able to solve our long-term fiscal crisis and make sure that the money is not being sucked into other priorities. But there is nothing fundamental in the American economy that would prevent us from being able to regain ground, rearm, and be able to maintain our advantage against our rivals.